All right. So
Good morning, good evening.
good morning and good evening. Thank you for joining. I'm sharing my screen and let us quickly jump into our introductions quickly. So we have our honored guest, Anirban Das, with us today. So we all know that BizKnight Product series is a 10-episode series on product management, and that we have successfully finished 3 episodes of it. On the 4th episode today, we have Anirban Das with us, who would be talking about the monetization strategies. That is the talk we have for today. To quickly talk about the participant experience, I think most of you would have already registered for BizKnight Product series. If you haven't, please do so. Only then you would be able to get the personalized experience. You'll receive your confirmation, and then you will find the invitation for every event in your calendar when it is open. And after the event, you'd be able to take the quiz. And based on your quiz's answer, you'd be able to unlock different avatorians over the journey. And people who are gaining more avatorians in blogging will be getting more gifts along the way. I think we just wanted to talk about the winners quickly. We have 9 winners for the first quarter of BizKnight Product series. Vedant, Yesha, Monica, Matthews, Joshua, Nidhi from ThoughtWorks. Congratulations to all of you for being winners of the first quarter of BizKnight Product series. Srivatsan Balan from Zoho, Prachi Bakwatkar from Infosys, and then Purnima Tamilmani from Kowe.co. The winners have been chosen on the basis of quiz scores, blogs, and active live participation. So congratulations to all of you once again. With that, we'll just start the episode 4 of BizKnight Product series. So we have Anirban Das with us, who's a product leader at Ola Electric, who's going to talk about monetization strategies, which is around the topic how to monetize the product by exploring various monetization models to define a sustainable and profitable business model, and validate the riskiest assumptions, willingness to pay, willingness to sell, and other factors with respect to sources of monetization. To quickly introduce Anirban, Anirban Das loves working with teams to build useful and delightful products that many users like to use. Anirban is the product leader at Ola Electric and has an eclectic experience working as the head of product at Dunzo and Hike Messenger. Anirban has also played the role of product manager at Zynga, Microsoft, RBS. Anirban has given several product talks and is also an instructor for the product management fellowship program at NextLeap. I think I've kind of shortened the introduction of Anirban. Probably with that, I'll hand over directly to you, Anirban. Welcome to BizKnight.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And good evening, and thank you for everyone who's joined. I'm sure all of you had alternate ways of spending this evening. Now, monetization is actually a pretty vast area. I realized that as I was sort of preparing the content for this talk. 2 or 3 of the models that we're going to look at, I have direct experience working in those, but several of the models, right, I've not directly used them. So I approach preparing for this talk for those models as I approach learning about most new things. So I tried to break the topic down, or the monetization model down, into its simplest form. I studied 2 or 3 examples of each of those models. And then I think what is important, especially as product managers, is figuring out the right questions to ask. So for each of the monetization models, what are the key considerations and what are the key questions that you need to ask and then answer before you actually go ahead and use the model? That's the third part of each of the models that we'll cover today. So let's keep the session as interactive as possible, and do feel free to interrupt me with questions as we go through the session. Okay. Coming up today, we look at 12 monetization models. I'm sure there are more, but there are 12 that I could find which had enough examples. We'll look at examples of companies which use those models. We'll cover the key considerations for the use of those models, questions, that you could ask before you evaluate concept. So to start off, I think monetization is all answering this question, how do companies actually make money? And on chat, like any ideas, like what are the monetization models that you've seen? Let's perhaps this might be a good test for me to see whether I've picked the right monetization models or not. So what are the ones that you've heard of or are familiar with? Ads, okay. Yes, we're definitely going to talk about ads. Subscriptions, yes. Premium membership subscriptions. Brands, freemium, okay. Okay. Data, yes, data monetization is another model that I came up with. E-commerce, selling a physical product. Okay, so here's the 12 that I could sort of research and find out. Maybe this is not a MECE classification and you might end up with certain terms which are used differently. But these are the 12 that we're going to cover today. So we'll talk about direct sales, we'll talk about ads, we'll talk about transactions, subscriptions, and then freemium, which is kind of a slight modification on subscriptions. Yes, which is white labeling. And then we'll also talk about sponsorships and affiliate marketing. So these are the 12 that we'll look at today. So starting off with direct sales, which very simply is possibly the simplest form of monetization, where companies directly charge customers when they buy a product. So user buys a product and then pays a company for it. That's as simple as it is. And when it comes to examples, I think Apple, through all the iPhones and other accessories that it sells, Ola Electric through the vehicles that we sell, IKEA through the furniture that it sells, right? These are all examples of direct sales as a model. Now, when it comes to the key considerations for direct sales, I think the first and most important consideration is customer reach. So who are your target customers? Where can you reach them either online and offline? I think these are the two most important questions that a company or a product manager who is using this technique must answer. Because based on whether you're selling fries or sushi, your customer reach strategy will change completely. If you're selling fries, you can literally open up a store anywhere because you have at the price point and for the kind of product that you're selling, in this case fries, you will have a target audience present in most places. But if you're selling something as specialized as sushi, you might need to be very, very selective. Similarly, whether you're selling an iPhone or whether you're selling a low-end feature phone, I think your reach strategy will change. So this is, I think, the most important consideration when you're using direct sales as a monetization model. Next up is the customer experience. So what are the steps of an ideal customer experience? Why should the customer care about each step? How can you measure the effectiveness of each step? As you scale, how do you ensure adherence to the ideal CX across all your touch points? What are the costs of each step, right? Because certain steps might be more complicated to set up and more expensive to set up. And then how do you ensure that the same ideal journey is actually replicated across locations? These are some of the questions that you need to think through, and having good answers to some of these questions have actually allowed brands like McDonald's or Starbucks to scale up their businesses pretty much all over the world. So designing the ideal customer experience, which involves having thought through answers for these questions, I think that's the second key consideration when it comes to using the direct sales model. The third consideration is infrastructure and logistics. So how will you actually get your products to the locations on time and at the desired quality standards, right? So this involves things like what your route plan is going to be. If you're going to use partners, what sort of partners will you have? How do you actually handle failures? If there's a customer who walks in and your product isn't available, um, that's potentially revenue left on the table, but can you actually handle that case well by possibly shipping the product to the customer after the customer has left the store? Um, the other important part of this is how do you actually forecast demand locally accurately? Because every time you have more inventory lying around, that's a cost. Similarly, every time you do not have the adequate inventory, that's potentially lost revenue. So how do you actually forecast demand? And especially if you have an offline or an omni-channel component to this model, then you actually need to forecast demand, not just at a global level, but also at a local level for each touch point that you have. And then finally, how do you also figure out how to handle your unsold inventory using some form of reverse logistics or a discounting strategy to get rid of your unsold inventory? So these are all key considerations that go in when you're using direct sales on the model. Pricing, I think, is a very involved topic, and I think you could do a separate talk possibly on pricing itself. But at its very basic level, you need to answer what all the costs involved in building the product are, and then also selling the product.
अंदर बहुत से गांवों में न्यूज़पेपर नहीं पहुंच पाते.
Okay. The other aspect to pricing is also how much are customers actually willing to pay for this product. There are multiple ways to actually try and answer this question. So you can look at competitive insights for similar products. You can run tests to identify willingness to pay, especially if your product is digitally fulfilled. You can go ahead and decompose your product into its features and try and assign value to each of those features. So there's multiple techniques involved. The other aspect to pricing is also how does this product get priced with regards to your portfolio of products. So if you're a mobile device manufacturer, so for example, the iPhone, right? You could have options where you're actually making 4% margins on one product, but 12% margins on another product. And you're targeting essentially a blended margin of a certain percentage, right? So that's the other input that comes into pricing. Then how do you factor in some seasonality aspects when it comes to pricing? Because your margin may not necessarily, you might not want to keep your margin the same during festive seasons and sales, for example. And then finally, how do you actually hedge against variations in input costs? That's another very important aspect when it comes to determining margin. So all of these are sort of considerations to keep in mind when it comes to determining your pricing strategy. Lastly, expansion. So how will you sort of, when you're selling a product in one store or one digital channel, as you increase your number of channels and your stores, how will you scale your systems as you increase your reach? How will you modify your systems and adapt them in case there are local nuances that you need to keep in mind? And then as you expand your product lines, do you actually need to build new systems in order to target those new customer segments? I think all of these are questions that you need to deal with when it comes to this model. Lastly, customer feedback and insights. So what systems do you have in order to capture, store, and analyze customer data? So every interaction which does not lead to a sale is also potentially a source of learning if you can capture what went on during that interaction. So you need to build systems to capture this. The other interesting thing is if you have such a system, then what it allows you is it gives you capability to test targeted changes for hypothesis that you have. So at Ola Electric, for example, we've got more than 500 experience centers that we set up. So anytime our marketing team wants to tweak a pitch based on a certain segment of customers, we can actually go ahead and almost run an offline A/B test where we're testing out a different pitch in a certain store and then using learnings to expand that across our stores. And then finally, there's legal and regulatory. Won't talk too much about that, but you need to stick to the laws of the land and you need to figure out which regulatory bodies you need to interact with, from the bribe that you might need to pay if you're setting up a small fast food store, to rules that govern how much investment can happen in any category, right? All of these actually have a material impact on the business. So this is another thing that must be considered when setting up a direct sales model. When it comes to competition, I think this is primarily a source of insight. So mapping out what the customer journey and the customer experience for the competition looks like, comparing it to yours offers a rich source of learnings. Understanding why certain customers might prefer the competition over yours, all of these offer a rich source of learning. So all of these are, I think, the key considerations when it comes to using direct sales as a model. The next model for monetization is advertising, which is essentially user sees a product, user uses a product, user sees ads for other products while using the product, and then advertisers pay for the company for ads seen or engaged. It's also possibly one of the oldest forms of monetization. The first ad actually occurred almost 3,000 years ago in Egypt. It was a papyrus created by a slaveholder who was actually trying to find a slave that ran away, and also promoted a weaving shop that they had. So advertising's probably been around for as long as any of the other monetization models. Examples we're all familiar with. I think three of the biggest companies when it comes to using advertising in the form of Google, Facebook, and Twitter. It's their primary monetization model, although Twitter's been trying to diversify how they're monetizing. But this still remains the primary source of revenue for these three companies. Most important consideration for advertising as a model is who's the target audience for the product, because advertisers will usually only advertise if you have a high degree of overlap with their target audiences. For larger products with multiple segments, so the likes of Facebook and Google, I think the next consideration becomes what are the targeting capabilities that you're actually providing advertisers, because these products tend to have multiple segments of users. You cannot offer, I guess Twitter is a different example because Twitter is a lot more homogeneous in terms of the user base. But when it comes to products like Google and Facebook, what are the targeting capabilities that you're offering to advertisers? And then what data do you actually collect to classify the users into target segments? I think these are the three key questions that you need to answer when you're looking to use advertising as a model. The next most important consideration is the ad formats and the placement. So how do you actually come up with the formats in a way that you do not actually end up compromising with the user experience? If it's too intrusive, then you will end up possibly hampering the user experience and leading to customer churn. So that's why you need to test multiple formats and fit in ads which do not compromise the user experience. And then how do you actually place these ads? How many of these ads do you place per unit of content that users are viewing, right? All of these are questions that you need to answer as product managers. And then finally, how do you actually, so these terms, right? The user experience, whether it's being compromised or not, relevance, fatigue, all of these terms. How do you actually measure if the experience is compromised or not? And if it's compromised, to what extent is it compromised? So that's where you need to define the right metrics in order to go ahead and sort of make these decisions more objectively. Next is, so ad formats and placement talk about the containers in which ads are shown, but you also need ad quality and ad relevance in order to have a good user experience. So starting off with the policies, what policies and guidelines do you have for advertisers and marketers to make sure that every basic ad meets a certain quality bar? How do you ensure that users see ads which are relevant to their interests and topics? How do you ensure that users don't see ads beyond the point of fatigue, which is the whole frequency aspect of ads? And then how do you actually measure these abstract terms like quality, relevance, and fatigue? Because that is what your algorithms and systems will use in order to go ahead and ensure that the experience and the revenue trade-offs are made properly. On a lighter note, YouTube seems to also have figured out how to monetize users who don't like ads by showing them a repeated collection of the most irritating ads. So it's just a twist on the advertising model, I guess. And so I happened to visit the Taj Mahal day before yesterday, and I was bombarded with tour guides who seem to insist to show you around the place. And possibly that's the YouTube ad-free technique could also be possibly used in offline tourism, right? Where you can buy a like, I don't want guides to interrupt me, and you wear sort of a black armband, and they just leave you alone. So possibly one monetization technique that you could use in an offline sense as well. But moving on, the next key consideration is performance tracking. So how do advertisers actually know how their ads are performing? And then based on the data, how do you provide actionable insights to advertisers to improve ad performance? I think this is one of the most important considerations if you have to use advertising as a monetization lever. And then how do you actually provide tools to advertisers so that they can run, like, validate their hypothesis and run experiments? And then once you have those systems in play, it's almost like layers. How do you extend those metrics, insights, and experiments from an ad to a campaign to eventually a brand level? So these are some of the questions that need to be answered if you're thinking about performance tracking. Finally, ad policies. What type of advertisers will you restrict? Google, for example, does not allow any platform that sells tobacco products or real money gaming to be listed on the Play Store. Whereas Apple seems to be okay with at least the tobacco products. What types of content are prohibited from being advertised, right? So clearly defining what is illegal, offensive, harmful, or misleading is essential, so that you can prevent the ill effects of it post an ad actually being taken live. What are some of the rules that you will enforce for the ad formats, placements, and assets that will be used, right? What's your review and dispute resolution mechanism? And then how do you make sure that these ads also comply with the regulatory requirements of the various markets that you're operating in? And finally, how do you make sure that this dual feedback mechanism from users as well as from advertisers? Because that will really help you improve your policies and your systems. With ads, the other aspect is also the actual management of relationships with the advertisers. So how do you ensure that you have an accurate understanding of each advertiser's needs and marketing objectives, right? Because an alignment there is, or a misalignment in those two, is usually the root of many of the problems that you will see. So that's where, account managers or that human component actually really helps, because you can understand what the advertisers' objectives are. How do you then ensure that these advertisers, based on their objectives and your own objectives, get personalized guidance, insights, best practices, any form of support in order for them to meet their marketing objectives? Whenever there are problems that the product cannot handle by itself, how do you ensure that there is speedy resolution of those problems? And then over the long term, how do you increase investment of advertisers on your platform? So these are again some key questions that need to get answered when it comes to forming healthy relationships with advertisers. Okay, the next one is transaction fees, which I think resembles a toll tax. And so in India, there's Paytm, which actually has this product called FASTag. And I think that's the best example of a product monetized by transaction fees. So every time a car passes through a toll, Paytm makes some revenue. And transaction fees based models are similar, right? Every time there's a core transaction, there's revenue to be made. So Stripe makes revenue for every payment that they process. Play Store and App Store makes revenue for every payment or in-app purchase that happens. Uber makes revenue for every ride that happens on their platform. Key considerations here. I think the value proposition and what exactly you're charging customers for needs to be extremely clear. And then the second thing that needs to get answered is why is it harder or more expensive for sort of others to build what you are charging them for, right? Or the moat question that needs to be answered. So in the case of Stripe, their ability to process payments across countries, across instruments, across a network of banks is what prevents another Stripe from coming in and sort of taking the market. And that's what causes Stripe's clients to pay them a cut on every fee. In the case of app stores, it's the billions of users that actually make it almost not a choice, right, for developers to pay the transaction fees that they charge. In the case of Uber, it's the liquidity of vehicles that actually actually cause users to pay that extra transaction fee. So I think those are the two most important considerations when it comes to value proposition. In fee structure, I think the two most important questions is whether you're actually going to charge a flat fee or the fee is going to be a percentage of the revenue that you're processing. So in the case of the app stores, I think it's a 30% of the revenue that is being processed. But in certain other, I think in the case of Stripe, it's on a per transaction basis. And then the second consideration is whether you're going to have a uniform structure or the structure will change with the number of transactions. So if you're a product or a company which is hoping to target startups and you want to sort of participate in their growth as it goes on, so maybe you might want to consider offering them free or lower commission for their first X transactions and then scaling it as they grow, right? So I think those are the two most important decisions to be made when you're deciding what your fee structure needs to look like. There's of course the user experience, but in the case of transaction fees, there might also be the developer experience to consider. So in the case of Stripe, for example, it allows developers to write like literally double-digit line of code and get payment set up, right? So that's a great developer experience. Similarly, what are the debugging tools that you're offering? What is the documentation that you're offering? What is the kind of support that you're offering? All of those are important components when you have a developer side to your product offering as well. Legal and regulatory is important here because there are bound to be laws on payments, especially if like fintech is usually heavily regulated in most countries. And I think at some point in the life cycle of a product, you also need to think about how do you actually generalize these requirements so that every subsequent geography launch or every subsequent regulatory requirement that you need to deal with, right? You don't need to sort of customize it and code it. You've generalized these requirements and have built a system which can allow, your go-to-market team to actually go ahead and scale faster, irrespective of what the regulatory requirements are. Okay, the fourth.
Anirban, there's a question in the chat from
Keep the
Jagdish
loyalty.
Kumar. Yeah.
How do you keep the loyalty when you start scaling the charges? Okay, that's a great question. So I think that's where the moat comes in, Jagdish. So in the case of let's say Stripe, right? Let's say you increase your charges from 2% to 3%. If there is no competing offering which offers you the kind of functionality that Stripe has, or put in another way, if your switching cost is actually higher than paying that extra commission, right? That's how you actually keep the loyalty. There are, of course, reasons like, your experience so far with Stripe being really, really great, etc. But I think the switching cost and the functionality that you offer, right? That essentially are the two main reasons in terms of how you keep loyalty.
Okay.
Like it,
Yeah.
like, and if you take the case of let's say Uber, right?
Mhm.
It's very hard for someone else to come in and create that much supply, and hence users will find it hard to switch from an Uber or an Ola to a third player because you will not get cabs that fast. So
Okay.
I think it depends on the type of business. But in the case of marketplaces like Uber or Ola, it's the liquidity of supply. In the case of Stripe, it's the amount of payment options, the number of countries in which it works. That becomes the reason to not switch. In the case of like Airbnb, for example, the sheer amount of listings and the types of experiences that you can offer, I think that would be the reason why people would not switch.
Yeah, mine was around, people who start with offering you, payment services, not in the kind of Stripe, like when you started, initially people with, billing, you started with Paytm, then there came Cred, and there was MobiKwik, and then there is Free Charge, right? You keep moving. There are enough number of platforms mushrooming there. So I was just referring to those kind of situations.
And I guess the examples that you use, right? That's why you had a lot of users actually using multiple of those products, and like whoever offered the most cashbacks, users actually switched. So I don't think they were necessarily able to build a moat and get that loyalty. Like let's say an Uber was able to get, or even a Stripe for that matter, right? For the B2B segment was able to get. Okay. So the fourth monetization model, which has possibly brought the biggest change in the media industry, which in the past used to be dominated by advertising, is subscriptions. And in the last 2 decades, we've seen subscriptions really take off in movies via the likes of Netflix, live sports via the likes of Hotstar, in the news via the likes of the Ken and the Economist, or even the New York Times actually has a subscription program now. Music and Spotify, and even documentaries, something as niche as documentaries has got a curiosity stream. So I think the biggest sort of beneficiary or adopter of subscriptions has been the media industry. That being said, you also have a subscription in shaving. So Dollar Shave Club, which is the example at the middle, is also using the subscription construct and model. And I guess what is common across all of these three is the frequency of use of the product, right? Subscriptions work really well when you tend to have a high frequency of use, but they don't work as well if your frequency of use is like really infrequent. So this is why you will not see a brokerage service offer a subscription. So the likes of No Broker will never have a subscription service, but you'll have subscriptions for media, which is like a really a daily or a weekly use case. So that's one of the interesting things about subscriptions. I think the most important thing about subscriptions is what is the value proposition, what are the unique benefits or features or content that you're offering to your subscribers. And so that's the more sort of easy to answer question. The second question that needs to be answered is how will those benefits, features, or content make your subscribers more entertained? In the case of Dollar Shave Club, look better, or in the case of The Economist, more informed, right? I think that's what you really need to convince your subscribers about before they actually start to take in the subscribers. And then you need to also figure out a way to test whether your target customers actually understand your value proposition message and remember your value proposition message effectively as well. Because in subscriptions, it's the first time that you actually see the value proposition. You may not necessarily convert immediately, you might convert sometime later. So that's where understanding recall also becomes important for product managers to figure out. The second is pricing. So what are all the costs involved in firstly building and selling the subscription? Willingness to pay, and then what is the cost of like content that you need to produce to have a target renewal and subscription rate, right? Especially in the media related categories. So as Netflix, you're not just thinking about what your current catalog is, you're also thinking about, okay, in the future, how much content do you need to keep producing for your different markets to make sure that you have a target renewal rate. And I think one of the most interesting parts of subscription is how do you actually price your subscription, if it's a single tier or across multiple tiers, so that you can maximize your revenue. This is especially true if the marginal cost of production is low, as is the case with content. If you're actually selling physical product subscriptions, it's not as important. But if you're actually selling digital products where your marginal cost of production is very low, then you need to run multiple tests so that you can figure out, how do you maximize your revenue as opposed to your revenue per customer. So that's one important consideration when it comes to pricing your subscriptions. The next part is the subscription model. So what's the time period in which you'll offer your subscription? Is it weekly, monthly, quarterly, half yearly? If it's a combination of them, how are you pricing each of those tiers? So those are all the important things to think through and test out. Will you have one tier or will you have multiple tiers? And on what basis will you choose those tiers? So for example, in Netflix, the resolution of the TV or the number of devices are the important parameters. But in the case of, let's say, a Dollar Shaving Club, it might be, I don't know, possibly the kind of materials that you're using for your shave, that might be the vector that you choose. So on what basis do you actually form those tiers, I think is a really important consideration as well. And then this dovetails into the freemium offering as well. So are you actually going to offer some sort of free tier for customers to try out the offering? And there's been multiple tests run on the next one, which is it better to offer a money back guarantee or is it better to offer a free trial? And at least basis the articles that I read, it seemed like a money back guarantee seems to convert a lot better than a free trial. But certainly worth testing if you're planning to use subscriptions as a construct. Then, of course, how do you actually acquire your customers? How much does it cost to acquire customers via paid channels? And how will you make it easier for customers to tell other customers or tell other potential subscribers? What's the customer experience look like? Key considerations here is, at what points in the experience will you actually prompt customers to subscribe? And I think Hotstar did this really well, where during the initial IPL seasons, they would allow you to watch the first 10 minutes of the match. And then at some point, they would actually tell you to subscribe. So I think that was a really smart experiment where you would be able to convince customers about the quality of the experience, about how there were no glitches, about the resolution in which you were offering the service, about the usability of the product before you actually got the customers to subscribe. And if the subscription prompt happened to happen at a crucial stage in the match, then possibly, that could even lead to even better conversion. So I think the timing of when you actually prompt the subscription is a very important aspect of the subscription journey as well. The other aspect is also, how will you actually allow, like, what does the termination journey for subscriptions look like, right? So you can obviously go in and through your payment method or terminate the subscriptions, but I think you need to create a journey where you understand why certain users terminated their subscriptions in order to improve your renewal rates in the future. So that's another important consideration in the customer experience of subscriptions. Next up is the content product strategy. So how do you ensure that subscriber value is either stable or preferably increasing over time for your subscribers? Because that is possibly the leading indicator of your renewal rate. If you have engagement going down as people subscribe, based on the duration post which they subscribe, then that's usually a leading indicator of lower renewal rates down the line. So I think it's important to actually measure engagement metrics and make sure that they're stable or going up for subscribers, subscriber cohorts based on when they subscribe. And if you're not a content-based subscription, then what are the additional benefits that you can offer subscribers as they spend more time as subscribers? Customer feedback and insights. So what events do you need to instrument to, specifically in the subscription and the renewal journeys, to measure drop-off? What tests can you run to sort of finalize your value proposition and your articulation of the value proposition? And then what insights can you capture during the subscription cancellation journey to tweak your offering for customers? In legal and regulatory, I think the most important one is to do with payments. So what are the guidelines related to recurring payments for the country or the market that you're operating in, to make sure that you can have a good recurring payment model? Next up is freemium, which is kind of a like product-led growth strategy for subscription offerings. So users essentially discover a product or service, they get a taste of the product or service for free, and then some percentage of those users actually upgrade to paid tiers. In return, the company usually has a lower acquisition cost because of the free tier, and then it makes up for this revenue by the users who actually upgrade to paid tiers. So some interesting examples here. So there's Dropbox, which is essentially offering the core product service, but of a limited amount. So it's offering 2 GB of storage, and as you sort of get closer to that limit, hopefully enough number of customers upgrade to more storage. Zoom does this similarly by offering 40-minute meetings for free, but for longer meetings, you need to actually get a paid subscription. Chess.com has a very interesting model where online games versus both players and computer AI is free, but then tools to actually become better at these games are offered at a premium. So tutorials, puzzles, all of those are actually offered as paid services. But to enjoy the core experience of playing games, it's completely free. So different approaches that different companies take. Here again, I think the nuance with the value proposition is you need to figure out what's the minimum value proposition that you can offer to showcase your product. But if this is too high, then you will not have enough users who actually upgrade to your paid tiers. But if it's too low, then you'll probably have churn even before customers reach the point where they actually want to upgrade to the paid tier. So I think you need to really find the balance, and I'm sure Dropbox and Zoom ran multiple tests to come up with 2 GB and 40 minutes, and chess.com would have experimented as well. I think looking at the competition to see what they're offering might be another input into determining your value proposition. And then you need systems in place to limit and prevent the abuse of these systems, right? So in the case of Dropbox, email accounts are fairly easy to create multiple of. So how do you make sure that you tackle that fraud? Or in the case of Zoom, maybe there's ways that you can extend the 40 minutes. So all of those edge cases need to be thought through as well. The other interesting aspect that a lot of companies seem to use is the level of support that is offered for the freemium customers versus the paid customers. And that could potentially be part of the value proposition as well. Target audience, again, very similar to subscriptions on the whole. So I'll just skip over that. The costs are an important aspect. So anytime you have a free model, right? So in the case of chess.com, there's server costs that chess.com needs to take care of for offering all these free games. And you want to make sure that you factor in all of these costs, because directly or indirectly, these costs are affecting the experience for your paid users as well. Because if you end up spending too much on the free tier, you might have to raise prices for the paid tier just to make that break-even math work. So I think being conscious of what these costs are and how it affects your paid user experience, I think is a very, very important consideration when you have a freemium model. Okay, the next one is in-app purchases, usually via selling virtual goods, and very popular in gaming, but also in certain other product categories. The interesting thing to note here is that in this technique, only a small percentage of users, typically less than 10%, actually buys these goods. And the value of these goods depends on the other 90% of users as well. So for example, in Fortnite, buying virtual shoes or clothes or dance moves and celebrations actually tends to impact the experience of other players as well. Or in Tinder, when you buy super likes, anyone who does not have super likes, their experience also gets impacted as well, because the probability of getting a match for the other person is influenced by a super like or a like. So that's a very interesting dynamic when it comes to virtual goods. So 3 examples. Tinder monetizes this via super likes and profile boosts, and even a like tool where you can actually see all of the people who liked you before you actually choose a match. So Those are the three features that Tinder monetizes. Fortnite does this via costumes, themes, celebration dances. And the interesting part is that none of these actually affect the core gameplay. However, there is social expression in the core gameplay. So they will not allow you to progress through levels faster or give you more powerful weapons. But because it's a multiplayer game, they actually allow you to get more social status and hence are of value. And then Calm does this via additional meditations, music tracks, and sleep stories. So that's how these three apps do it. I think as we discussed, the key consideration here is how does the purchase enhance the core value proposition without necessarily negatively impacting the core value proposition for other users. So that's the trade-off that you need to get absolutely right if you're considering using in-app purchases. So for Tinder, it makes my like stand out compared to other likes, but at the same time, it does not prevent any other user from liking, right? Boosts actually help my profile to get discovered much more prominently for the next 30 minutes in an area, hence improving the probability of a match, but it does not prevent any other profile from getting discovered. Fortnite allows me to stand out with respect to other players, but it does not help me progress in the game faster than other players. Calm gives me a better real or perceived meditation experience, but it does not hamper the meditation experience for other players. So how do you actually ensure that the non-buyers do not perceive the buyers getting an unfair advantage? I think that's the central question that needs to be answered when it comes to value proposition for in-app purchases. The other one is monetization timing. So like what's the exact or what's the most optimal point in the journey to prompt freemium users to upgrade to paid tiers? So high score moments in games or near misses in games, or like Candy Crush is a great example, right? When you have two moves left or two candies left, and then you end up losing a life, conversion is likely to be like more than 2x higher at those points, right? So those are all places where you can actually prompt this. Or in the case of Calm, let's say you have a streak of 7 days meditating, that's a win moment for the user. Maybe that's the point that you want to actually go ahead and prompt monetization. So and as a product manager, what you're looking to do here is you want to maximize the number of parallel experiments that you have to discover these timing opportunities, because sometimes these timing opportunities can be very, very counterintuitive. You might have a hypothesis, but when you run these tests, you might actually discover something completely counterintuitive. So you want to maximize the number of experiments that you have based on the user base and the scale that you have. The overall user experience, as we spoke about, how do you ensure that it does not end up compromising the overall user experience? This explains why boosts are set to 30 minutes and not the entire day, and why super likes for Tinder subscribers are set to 5 per week and not infinite, right? So having these set to infinite would have made the experience for non-buyers subpar, potentially leading to churn for them, and then that's your funnel for actually converting buyers. So that's why this trade-off is a really, really important trade-off. When it comes to personalization and targeting, so what user signals will you use in order to identify which users are more likely to convert so that you can focus your efforts on those users? How will you target these users either inside or outside the app? And then potentially, how will you personalize your offerings for each type of users, right? So when you're selling virtual goods in games, for example, who's likely to buy costumes versus weapon skins versus celebrations might be different personas. So you want to find out what signals you can use in order to classify those users into those segments and then sell the right products to the right personas. And then, of course, doing all of this while staying within the guidelines of the App Store and the Play Store. Or as Fortnite did, violating these policies as a conscious strategy, right? Fortnite actually went ahead and bypassed these guidelines and passed on the benefit of evading the 30% tax directly to its consumers. In the process, they got delisted. So you either want to stick to these policies, or even if you're like violating these policies, you do it as part of a conscious strategy. Okay, the next one is data monetization, where
Anirban, there are two questions in the chat. Can we cover that?
sure. So in a price sensitive, okay,
This is regarding the transaction-based pricing, I suppose.
in a price
Anuj?
sensitive market like India, is it really possible unless you have a monopoly? Like, when you say, is it really possible? Are you referring to loyalty? Like, what does it refer to?
Yes, it was loyalty actually. So when you're talking about loyal customers, so in India it's very price sensitive. The day you get discounts from another app, people actually switch. So unless you have the deep pockets, you cannot actually sustain the customers.
So I think it's also got to do with the function of the category. So in, let's say, let's take the Ola and Uber example, right? Even if I were somehow able to get 100 cabs on the road, and I offered discounts, right? I would not be able to scale that beyond a point because of the liquidity in supply that Ola and Uber has. And with that liquidity comes ETAs, comes availability, right? So I think that loyalty is also, but if you take a parallel example of, let's say, a transaction app like Paytm or PhonePe, right? If I was able to get enough number of merchants on board and offered higher discounts, then you might find more people actually switching, right? So, or if you take, let's say, a media related property, right? If you were able to come up with better content, then you might actually find more people switching. So I think it's also got to do with the value of the platform, right? Where does it actually stem from, and how hard is it to actually replicate that? So that's, I think, the other variable. But in the case of Uber and Ola, one interesting thing that we're seeing in India is Blue Smart is actually using a combination of new technology, which is electric vehicles, cleaner cabs, which is one of the complaints that most consumers have about Uber and Ola, and a different model where they're actually using common charging points as the point at which drivers actually get access to these cabs. So a combination of these three, and they seem to be getting some amount of traction. So certainly seems to be possible, even though you have like a duopoly in the category. Okay. Next question. Free offerings are most of the time an investment or free ad to bring customers onto the platform. What all factors should a service provider consider when moving from freemium, as freemium might not work? How to know the right time? So I think multiple parts to the question. I think some of them I covered and answered, but I think the how to know the right time, right? I think you need to have the right tracking in place to understand the journeys that customers are going through. B, analyze those journeys to try and find patterns in where drop-offs are happening, where people are actually converting. So having those. And C, having very sharp hypothesis on ideas or insights that you might want to test out, right? So if you have these three in place, then you might be able to discover the right time. I don't think there's standard answers for the right time for that work across a set of contexts and products and user segments. But I think using a combination of these three, you might be able to discover what the right time might be. Sorry if it's a generalized answer, but I don't think there's a formula based answer for how to know the right time here. Also, freemium might not work from day one. I'm not sure what you mean by that, because freemium, as you rightly pointed out yourself, right, is usually a product-led growth acquisition strategy for something that you're upselling later on. So if that's the case, you would possibly have what you're upselling in place along with the freemium. You would not go in with a freemium and then figure out what your offering is. So I'm not entirely sure about how to answer that part of your question. Maybe if you can elaborate what you meant on that, Anuj, I can take that part of the question.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like why there are not any successful stories where they were like premium from day one, right? So free is a kind of, you have to start with free and then you move to say freemium, or to become successful, and that could happen unless or until you have deep pockets, right? So maybe that's the reason we don't have any successful stories or many successful stories coming out of India.
I can't comment on successful stories or not, because at least globally we've seen a lot of successful stories, and I'm sure there might be examples even in India, because the model as such, I don't think it's got much to do with this thing. So again, I can't really comment on why. It's a good question, but I can't top of my mind think of why that might be the case.
No
Okay.
problem. Thank you. Yeah.
So moving on to data monetization. So while social networks use data to offer advertisers targeting capabilities to show more relevant ads, there's also another class of companies which actually directly monetize the data itself, right? So Nielsen provides companies insights on what consumers watch and what consumers buy. And then companies thereby use those to form their marketing and product strategies. Bloomberg, their main revenue generating product is the Bloomberg Terminal, which provides current and historical financial data and news about pretty much every financial instrument traded in the world. Experian collects and aggregates information for more than 1 billion people and businesses, including almost 230 million in the US and 25 million US businesses. And companies can use that data in order to do things like credit and risk scoring. So these three are examples of companies which actually sell insights based on data that they collect and aggregate. So key considerations here: how do you actually collect, store, and process this data in compliance with local regulations? How do you ensure data accuracy, right? What do you do, for example, when there are two data points across multiple sources, but they conflict with each other, right? So those are some of the questions that you need to answer here. How do you ensure that data is recent and accurate? Because the data also might be constantly evolving. Then how do you ensure that data is anonymized at an individual level and clients do not end up exploiting individual users? How do you aggregate this data for clients, and how do you then form segments to offer advertisers? How do you ensure that data policies are being adhered to across your ecosystem? How do you ensure personally identifiable information is protected and anonymized? What data should be monetized versus not? Those are all ethical considerations. So all of these become important considerations when data monetization is a primary source of monetization. Okay, the next one is rentals, which was pretty interesting as well. And there are always some products that do not have utility all of the time, right? So Christmas lights or Diwali lights, as an example, right? You use them for a certain amount of time in a year, and then you get rid of them. Or there might be products which are unaffordable to buy for users. So rentals exploit these insights to actually monetize these products. Airbnb is possibly the best known example of rentals, but you even have Zoomcar, which does a similar thing for cars, and then Rent the Runway actually uses this model for high-end fashion as well. So you have this model being used for different types of assets. I think the important considerations here are the demand pattern, right? So what is the demand pattern for the asset or the product across time, as well as geographical axis? How predictable is this demand, and what is the duration of use for this product once it's rented? So I think these are the three most important questions to answer. The second aspect is, how do you actually maintain the product quality after it's been used? So in the case of Zoomcar, they use a combination of photos to detect if a product has been damaged, but they also have a fleet of maintenance and repair mechanics who actually go ahead and fix these, right? Airbnb charges a cleaning fees to make sure that the next customer who walks into an Airbnb home actually gets a great experience as well. So really important parameter or consideration for offering rentals. Then what's your pricing strategy? So what's the cost of the product or asset? You need to estimate the total number of users over the lifetime, especially if you're the one who's actually holding the inventory. What are the costs involved in maintaining the product? What is the price of the product? And then how do you actually take all of these inputs and come up with your rental price? Rental terms, you need to make decisions on whether there's a security deposit involved. What happens if the product gets damaged? How is the liability going to get attributed? How do you take care of insurance in the case of damage and theft? How do you communicate rental terms to all of these terms to users so that they actually understand them? So all of these are very important considerations when it comes to rental. Then how do you actually think about inventory management? So how do you manage your matching of the supply of products with demand on geographical as well as time axis? In certain cases like Yulu, for example, how do you actually take care of the movement of goods while also ensuring product availability, right? So that's a tricky thing for electric scooters on demand. And how do you then minimize the costs of inventory storage? Because that has a significant impact on your business. Licensing is when a company makes a valuable technology, but does not want into getting into selling the technology directly. So just to take a extreme example to make this point clear, if tomorrow you came up with a teleportation technology, you could basically take two paths. One path is you reinvent the entire infrastructure around building airports or equivalent of airports, traveling to those airports, selling tickets to those airports, all of that, right? Or the other option could be you just license this technology to airline operators and reuse all of their infrastructure. And then that's one way you could monetize this technology as well. So different companies take different paths based on what their strategies and their strengths and weaknesses might be. But when it comes to licensing, companies usually license their technology to resellers, and then they take a percentage of the revenue for every product that is sold by resellers. So 3 examples: Google Maps, which in addition to having an individual consumer product, also is present in every application that makes the use of maps. So order tracking in e-commerce, navigation in vehicles, etc., etc. Windows is primarily sold by laptop and PC manufacturers, because without the OS, the hardware is of limited use. And then MathWorks, which makes products for scientists and engineers, licenses MATLAB, a programming language for numeric computing, so that developers use MATLAB to create their applications, and then MATLAB takes a cut for every application that is built using MATLAB. So key considerations is what's the value proposition, and what aspects of the product are most valuable for customers. So for Google Maps, in the licensing construct, ETAs and routes work for order tracking, but offering customization on places and search will compromise data integrity of Google Maps. So they will not offer those for licensing, right? And then the next question is, how does the value proposition that you're offering actually fit into the licensee's product value proposition? It's fairly trivial for Windows and laptop manufacturers, but in the case of Google Maps, you need to think through what parts of Google Maps functionality are you going to offer a Swiggy or a Zomato, so that it offers value for their customers. What's the licensing model? Are you going to use a perpetual license? Is it going to be subscription based? Is it going to be usage based? Those are all decisions to be made. How does the licensing model get renewed? How does a licensee actually get out of the license if they find a better license, better alternative? I think these are all things that must be considered in the licensing model. Then when it comes to the license management, how do you actually enforce the terms of the license? How do you prevent misuse? How do you prevent things like piracy? These are all considerations that you must feed in, especially when it comes to content, right? Which can get replicated and become pirated. So all of these are considerations when it comes to license management. Legal and regulatory, how will you protect your IP? How do you ensure with compliance with local regulations? And then what is the dispute resolution mechanism in case one of them happen? White labeling is actually a modification. I think it goes one step further than licensing, and it allows licensees to modify and rebrand the technology as well. So dropshipper is a company that collects, processes, packages, and dropships coffee beans according to the client specifications and preferences. So you can have a Colombian black coffee brand, and then someone could have like a Chennai filter coffee brand. And then drip shipper will actually go ahead and ship your customers the products according to your specifications. Similarly, Shopify Plus allows intermediaries to sell Shopify offerings with their own to sellers. And MailChimp Pro also does something pretty similar. Licensing could be successful if the copyright are quite strong. In a country like India, avoid copying is very difficult. So Anuj, yes and no, because you can also prevent copying using technology, right? Where the laws may not be the ones who are actually enforcing it, but you could use technology to prevent copying and thereby like prevent replication of the technology. So this could be in the form of using code obfuscation techniques where the IP is actually in the algorithm itself, or it could be in other forms of technology as well. Okay. Then you've got partner selection. So is the partner that you're choosing likely to dilute your core value proposition and brand value or not? That's one important consideration. Does your partner actually allow you entry to adjacent industries or geographies? So if you're a drip shipper and you're present in North America and you want to enter Asia, you might actually tie up with partners and go with the white labeling route. Could the partner actually offer you a regulatory advantage based on, investment laws of the country? So those are some considerations when it comes to partner selection. And then integration points are basically how do you actually integrate with your client's product and how much investment is needed on the client side versus your side. Branding, how much of the branding will be yours versus the client. And one option here is also to go with co-branding, but will that actually confuse or enhance the value proposition for the end customer? And then finally, what will the revenue sharing model look like? Will you use tiers to incentivize clients acquiring more end users? Sponsorships, I think they are primarily used in sports, celebrities, influencers, and events. And it's a variant of the advertising model. So Amazon sponsored the Filmfare Awards in 2020 to highlight their sales events. Tata backed the title sponsor deal with IPL to advertise their products across portfolio. Michael Jordan actually changed the paradigm of the sneaker industry by getting a revenue share deal for the Air Jordan line of shoes. So at the time, basketball sneakers actually sold less than 1 million for Nike before Nike signed Michael Jordan. And Adidas and Converse were actually favorites to sign Michael Jordan. But thanks to Nike's marketing strategy of offering Michael Jordan his own line of shoes, and of course, Michael Jordan's achievements in basketball, Air Jordans today bring in billions in revenue for Nike, and Michael Jordan earns 400 million in passive income from that deal that they had signed. So sponsorships can be a very, very effective way to monetize, but then not every sponsorship deal is likely to work out as great as the one that Nike had with Michael Jordan. So key considerations here is alignment, and this is three-part alignment: the company, the celebrity, and the audience, right? Are the values aligned across all these three parties or not? Next is audience reach and engagement. So for the company, is the influencer or the celebrity's audience actually complementary and in line with the audience that the company needs to reach? So I think those are the important considerations. How much customization and exclusivity will the brand get in partnership with the celebrity or the team, right? So these are, I think, the important considerations for sponsorships. Finally, affiliate marketing. It's primarily used by e-commerce players as a way to drive traffic and conversion. And the benefit for media companies and individual content creators is it's a way for them to actually monetize their content. So TripAdvisor has a large network of travel bloggers and content creators. Amazon has associates, millions of content creators who do product reviews. And then ClickBank offers more than 50,000 products for sale to over 5 million affiliates. And Meesho, I think, operates in a similar model as ClickBank as well. So I think having clear set of selection criteria for affiliates and a mechanism to acquire, train, and then engage more affiliates, I think that's the first key consideration. What are the commercial terms for the affiliates? And how do you ensure that fraud and abuse are prevented in the program? That's the second key consideration. And then how do you set up incentive structures to ensure continued results, right? You don't have affiliates who, let's say, bring in sales from their first degree network in the first month, and then they sort of taper off, right? So those are some of the key considerations. And finally, there's the tracking, right? So how do you track each touch point of the end user with respect to affiliate properties and the website? Because ultimately it's your products which are being sold. And how do you take care of attribution? So across affiliates and your other marketing channels, who gets how much credit for the eventual sale? I think that's one very important thing that needs to be worked out as well. So TripAdvisor, for example, pays out as long as a travel option is explored on its partner site, even if a transaction is not completed. But Amazon pays its affiliates only when a sale happens. So there are considerations and different options that companies use. And then finally, the promotional kit, which helps it easier for affiliates for their content creation and eventually sales. And then the other thing you need to ensure is how do you make sure that affiliates do not end up providing any inaccurate or misleading information to end users. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the session today. We looked at these 12 different models. We looked at the basic definition of the models, examples of companies that use those models, and a few considerations that may be important if you ever plan to use these models yourself. I'd love to take if there's any more questions or feedback. Otherwise, we can call it a day for today.
You could see that there are some. Okay, people are actually thanking you and Nitin for the session. This is really an eye opener for a lot of people. Some of the monetization models, I think you have gone into the details and given what are the different aspects to consider there. Thank you so much. Any other questions from people? If you have, please unmute and ask your questions directly to Anirban. All right. There are a lot of praises to you, Anirban.
No, everyone.
There are no questions, then thank you so much, Anirban. Thanks for your time and coming here to give us this monetization model talk. This was really helpful, and we are also going to share the recording with other people. Already I've started getting chats where people who had to drop off to the other meeting in the hub, they were asking, I want the recording to see the next stuff. So that says how much people are looking forward to it. Thank you so much for coming here and making this a great talk today. Thank you, people. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.